Grandmaster Jean de Valette stands on the ramparts of Fort St. Elmo, his face a map of 70 years of war as the horizon disappears behind the sails of 193 Ottoman warships. Below him, the turquoise Mediterranean is being choked by the wooden giants of Sultan Suleiman's armada. This is not just a battle for an island. It is the final barrier between a triumphant Ottoman caliphate and the fragile, fracturing heart of Europe. The air is thick with the sulfur of early artillery and the desperate metallic tang of blood as the Knights Hospitaller prepare for an annihilation they know is coming. The Knights Hospitaller prepare for an annihilation they know is coming. The island is a speck of rock, yet the entire world watches as the impregnable legend is put to the ultimate test. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? The Great Siege of Malta, the ultimate survival story. Just months before the first cannon fired, Malta was far from the legendary fortress we know today. It was a barren, overlooked rock, a refuge for the homeless Order of St. John after their brutal expulsion from Rhodes. The Ottomans viewed it as a nuisance, a base for Christian corsairs that threatened their vital supply lines to North Africa. But Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent saw a greater strategic prize, a path to dominate the Mediterranean entirely. He believed a swift, overwhelming strike would crush the Knights in weeks, clearing the path for total conquest. This grand illusion of an easy victory blinded the Ottoman commanders to the sheer defensive brilliance of one man. Jean de Valette had spent every waking moment fortifying these cliffs and training his 600 knights for the inevitable. They were ready for a war the world thought they could never survive. The ambition that drove the Knights of Malta was the same crusading fire that had burned for centuries, a theological imperative that defined them as the shield of Christendom. They were a monastic order with a lethal edge, survivors of every major siege of the last 200 years. These ancient echoes were visible in their defensive posture. They didn't fight for land, but for a sacred mandate. The Ottomans, too, were driven by a sense of divine destiny, viewing themselves as the rightful heirs to the Roman and Byzantine legacies. They were the heirs to the Roman and Byzantine legacies, driven by a sense of divine destiny. This was a collision of two absolute faiths, where both sides believed that God was not just on their side, but demanding the destruction of the other. This was a collision of two absolute faiths, where both sides believed that God was on their side. A battle for the soul of the Mediterranean had begun. Jean de Valette was the architect of defiance, a man whose logistical genius was matched only by his absolute refusal to surrender. Facing him were the Ottoman commanders Mustafa Pasha and Piali Pasha, burdened by a fractured command structure and an underestimate of their foe. While de Valette operated as a singular, chillingly calm mind, the Ottoman leaders were trapped in a constant cycle of ego-driven bickering. The Ottoman leaders were trapped in a cycle of ego-driven bickering and tactical frustration. This contrast in leadership styles, the unified focus of the Knights versus the fragmented Ottoman command, became the decisive variable. The singular, unified focus of the Knights was their greatest strength. The fragmented, paranoid Ottoman command became the decisive variable in the siege's outcome. The Battle of Mines had begun. The Ottomans brought 40,000 veteran soldiers, but they ignored the silent variable of Mediterranean geography, the heat and the exhaustion of siege logistics in an arid climate. By midsummer, the lack of fresh water and the relentless sun began to take a toll on the Ottoman ranks, far greater than the Knights' muskets. Furthermore, the silent variable of the Knights' defensive intelligence, using hidden tunnels and early warning systems, meant that the Ottomans were constantly walking into traps. They were fighting not just a garrison, but an island that seemed to fight back as a singular sentient organism. The Knights used every cliff, cave, and narrow passage as a force multiplier against the massive Ottoman pressure. The exhaustion of siege logistics in this arid climate shattered the Ottoman momentum. Malta was an island that fought back. The silent variable was about to become the decisive factor. While the history books focus on the Knights, the shadow narrative is the story of the Maltese people. Thousands of local citizens, men, women, and children, were drafted into the defense. They worked alongside the Knights to rebuild walls and transport supplies under heavy fire. They were not holy warriors, but survivors who knew that a lost siege meant enslavement. Their shadow labor, the hauling of heavy limestone and the extinguishing of fires, was the unseen engine of the defense. This unseen engine kept the fortifications from collapsing when the Knights were physically unable to continue. They cared for the wounded when the knights were physically unable to continue. The shadow narrative was the true heart of Malta. The Ottoman plan was to blockade the island and starve the garrison, but the island's rocky terrain and hidden underground cisterns made it nearly impossible to cut off. The Ottoman plan was to blockade the island and starve the garrison. The logistical nightmare for the Ottomans was the necessity of transporting siege artillery up steep, jagged cliffs. De Valette exploited this, constantly sortising to destroy Ottoman equipment. For the knights, logistics was the desperate game of trading gold for extra supplies from passing ships. Malta became a hungry, armored machine that required constant input to stay alive. They were staying alive against the massive, static Ottoman pressure. The war room was everywhere. The siege reached its turning point at Fort St. Elmo. The small fort was promised to fall in 3 days, but held for over a month. When it finally fell, the Ottomans had lost 8,000 of their best troops. This moment, the sheer cost of St. Elmo broke the Ottoman momentum. De Valette used the delay to prepare the primary defenses. When the Ottomans finally crossed the waters to attack the main forts, they were exhausted and demoralized. It transformed their invasion into a grinding, soul-crushing war of attrition they were never prepared to win. The Ottoman momentum was broken. The point of no return had been reached. The Ottoman command calculated that the total capture of Malta was worth any cost, but they failed to calculate the moral impact of their own losses. They viewed their soldiers as replaceable, but the loss of their elite janissaries shattered the morale of the entire army. De Valette's cold calculus was different. He knew that every Ottoman soldier killed was an irreplaceable blow to the Sultan's prestige. Every Ottoman soldier killed was an irreplaceable blow to the Sultan's prestige. He was willing to sacrifice his last knight to ensure that the Ottoman victory would be a strategic failure for the empire. The strategic math had turned against the Sultan. Inside the Ottoman command, the friction between the naval and land commanders reached a breaking point. With the failure to take the main fortifications, accusations of cowardice and incompetence became the daily routine. This friction paralyzed the Ottoman response during the crucial moments of the knight's greatest weaknesses. Meanwhile, inside Malta, de Valette maintained total discipline by threatening death to anyone who spoke of surrender. The internal friction in one camp led to hesitation, while the internal cohesion in the other led to iron-willed execution. Cohesion versus friction, iron versus doubt. The fortress would not bend. When the Ottoman fleet finally retreated in September, the cleanup was an act of grim survival. The island was a scarred, lunar landscape, with thousands of unburied bodies and walls that were more rubble than stone. The island was a scarred landscape with walls that were more rubble than stone. The knights didn't celebrate. They immediately began rebuilding, knowing that the Sultan would eventually return. The island had been saved, but the population was decimated, and the once impregnable fortress was a hollowed-out skeleton. The true cleanup was the transition from a siege site to a permanent, hardened bastion. Rebuilding had begun, and the island would never be the same again. Modern excavations of the bastions reveal the forensic reality of 1565. Archaeologists have found massive stone cannonballs and the remains of countermine tunnels, providing a physical record of the siege's intensity. Massive stone cannonballs, a physical record of the siege's intensity. Beneath the modern streets of Valletta, the ancient defensive network is still visible, a testament to the engineering genius that saved the order. These forensic layers tell a story of a city that was designed to be a weapon, where every stone was placed to maximize defensive potential. Every stone was placed with the intent of maximizing defensive potential, a city designed to be a weapon. The forensic reality of the Great Siege remains etched into every stone of Malta today. Imagine a knight, exhausted and bleeding, clutching a broken sword while watching the horizon for a relief fleet that may never come. He is surrounded by the ghosts of his brothers, realizing that his vow of poverty is now irrelevant. He realizes the world he sacrificed for is falling apart. The human toll is not just the casualties, but the shattering of a world. The human toll is not just the 30,000 Ottoman casualties or the thousands of defenders who died. It is the total displacement of the Maltese identity, a culture reshaped into a bastion of war. The culture was forever marked by the terror of those 4 months. The cost was absolute. We will never forget the price of defiance. The survival of Malta shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility in the Mediterranean. It proved that even the mightiest empire could be stopped by a small, disciplined force holding a strategic bottleneck. The scar on time left by this siege fundamentally altered the balance of power. It forced the Ottomans to retreat from their Mediterranean ambitions. This victory ensured that Europe would remain politically and religiously fractured for centuries. It was a victory of defiance that echoed for centuries, redrawing the geopolitical map. A victory of defiance that echoed for centuries. History had been reshaped, the fortress remained standing. If you were standing on those walls, watching the fleet retreat, would you have felt triumphant, or would you have seen only the terrifying cost of an ideological war? We judge the knights for their rigidity and the Ottomans for their expansion, but in the ruins of Malta, we see the limit of human ambition. History is written by the survivors, but the stone of the bastions still whispers the names of those who were willing to turn their world into a fortress. They turned their world into a fortress just to keep a single promise alive. Was the survival of the order worth the destruction of the island? Malta remains, a scar on time, a legend of survival. The Great Siege of Malta, a victory of defiance. Join the archive for more stories from the dark corners of history. Final chapter closed.